Okay, now I would like to introduce our featured reader. Oh God, this is not going to work out for me.
Just say anything.
All right. Dr. Darrell Bourque is a former professor of English at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, and also at University of Southwestern Louisiana. There we go. He is, how many books have you published?
6.
He is the author of 6 volumes of poetry, and the most recent being the one he's reading through from tonight, Megan's Guitar, and other poems from Acadie. Darrell is a former Poet Laureate of Louisiana, and has read here in the past with Jack Waddell. What was the name of that volume?
Conversations in Verse.
Conversations in Verse, a volume in which he and Jack alternated poems back and forth, a poetic conversation. It was a wonderful reading, and it's a wonderful book. I mean, and I believe you have some copies of this to sell today, as well as your new and collected poems. Okay, very good. So, I'm a terrible host because I'm doing a terrible job introducing you. But anyway, let me just get out the way. Everybody please welcome Dr. Darrell Bourque.
It's always a pleasure to be here in Eunice reading to you, because to a large extent, now I'll say a little bit more about this later on, to a large extent there are some people from Eunice who had a great deal to do with the making of this particular little book, Megan's Guitar and other poems from Acadie. And they are people who may be some of your relatives, and they may be people that you've never even heard of before. But they're incredible artists who appeared on the scene sometimes earlier in the 20th century. I'm speaking of Amédée Ardouin and Sadie Kerrville, and I just had a senior moment. I had a third person in mind, those Cajun and Creole musicians who, to a large extent, helped me to understand who I was and helped me to understand the culture that I came from. This book is basically divided into 2 parts, and there's correspondence between the first part of the book and the second part of the book. Lots of the poems that I wrote for the first part of the book, I wrote as a kind of elegy for my mother, who was dying at the time that I was writing these poems, and I got a commission from Chicory Bloom Press out of Thibodeau to write a chapbook. So I said, well, I can give you 14 poems. And this is one of the poems called Holding the Notes. And I think the only thing that I need to tell you about this poem, other than the fact that it deals with my mother's dying, is that she was a beautiful singer, but singing for her was always very private. And whenever she thought anybody was listening to her singing, she stopped. This poem is called Holding the Notes. The list the hospice nurse gives us to read tells us what to expect. As we approach death, it tells us we will do these things. Our eyes will water. We will become agitated and anxious. We will breathe shallow breaths. We will talk to parents and siblings long dead. We will reach and grasp for things no one else sees in that room where we are dying. What is not on the list is singing, and yet it is singing my mother has allowed to surface in these last days. I recall how as a child I heard her full-throated wonders, not to us, but as something solitary, something all hers. If I walked into the room she was in, she would stop. So I usually stayed in the backyard listening to her. She would be on her hands and knees scrubbing the kitchen linoleum, and phrases from the Latin Mass poured out from her. cutting corn from Akshu filled with holy sounds. Scouring potatoes and caramelizing onions were inseparable from music embedded in the acts themselves. In these last days now, she is separate from us again. Every inquiry about how she is doing or feeling is met with the same reply, I'm fine. We are no longer there as something to tend to. Whatever moored her to us, she is loosening with a song we can barely hear, and would not hear if she had not already shown us that early and abiding pleasure that was hers and hers alone. One of the kinds of poems that I like to write is an ekphrastic poem, where you look at a painting and you find inside the painting a story, or you find inside the painting the poem that the painting is telling you to write. And so I might be looking at this and seeing this little piece of the painting and deciding that that's where the poem is going to come from. I looked after the earthquake in Haiti at a painting by Barbara Hughes of a young Haitian girl who was about 10 years old, who had a pair of white patent leather shoes that had no ties or no strings to it, and she was dressed in a little flowered dress. She had a full head of African island hair, and she had her hands in her hair. I grew up in a Creole Cajun community, and one of the first things, and I think one of the really important things that helped me to become a poet, was listening to different kinds of languages and to listening to the richness in a variety of language. In homage to this little Haitian girl, Gertie, I wrote the poem in Louisiana Creole. I wouldn't dare to try to write it in Haitian Creole, but I wrote it in the Creole that I grew up listening to. So there are parts of the poem that are in Louisiana Creole and parts of the poem that are in English. And if you want me to translate it, I'll read it as it appears on the page. And if you want me to translate it, I'll be happy to do that. Venus rising in Haiti. Tu restes des fois dans Port-au-Prince, tu restes des fois dans la campagne, tu restes des fois sur les montagnes, tu restes tout le temps dans ton cœur, tu restes tout le temps dans le cœur de votre pays. When Barbara Hughes saw you that day in the courtyard at the orphanage, she saw a nascent Venus just landed in a place where she was very happy. She placed you in a frame of stars and waves and mountains, glyphs she borrowed from the vending hats and taxis and doorways where you live. You are firmly grounded on the pavers even though your new shoes have no ties. No ties is something you are used to somewhat. Sometimes you have family and sometimes you do not. It is the way it is. Happiness for you comes and goes in flashes, always has. You are a little girl in love with those white shoes with taps. They mark out sounds of a heart singing. You are a little girl in love with the dress Flora herself could have given you. In love with your thick hair you raise your arms to bring your fingers to. In love with the very earth that will crack open under you. For a brief time, you will be terrified and you will scream out in fear like all those around you. You will lose your friends under rubble. You will lose the way you played in streets. You will lose the songs your sisters sang to and from classes. You will lose the sounds of your uncle's drums. You will lose nearly everything you know, but not for long. One day, you will hear a single voice in a nearby road singing, on va jamais dire jamais. On n'est pas capable de dire jamais. Jamais. A crowd will snake through what has fallen down singing, on va jamais dire jamais, plutôt on a fait chanter l'amour, l'amour, l'amour. They will pick you up and you will sing that with them. M'on va courir loin, m'on va courir deux. À cette heure, nous on a fait chanter l'amour, espoir, l'avenir. C'est tout on a, c'est tout qui reste. Aujourd'hui, on a fait chanter l'avenir et l'espoir, l'amour. The third and the last poem from the first part of the book is a poem called Church Point Breakdown. And this is an homage to Ira Lejeune. Ira Lejeune, whose life ended just a few miles from here when they were widening Highway 190 into a 4-lane. Ira Lejeune had just finished playing a gig in Eunice, and they had a flat in the car that they were riding, and he stepped out of the car, and a car hit him going about 70 miles an hour and threw him 200 feet or so into a rice field. Ira Lejeune is an important figure in my own experiences as a person growing up in Louisiana. And Church Point Breakdown is one of his most popular songs. There's another reference to a song by Ira Lejeune called Viens me chercher, Come Get Me. And in that particular poem, what happens is that Ira Lejeune imagines the singer in the song being in love with a young woman whose father forbids that love. Where art thou, Romeo? And so they can't ever get together. And Viens me chercher is a little song that has as its setting the man, the young boy, imagining that he's lying next to his girlfriend and he's telling her, come get me, Viens me chercher. The whole of the song, the poem is built on various songs. How many of you have ever heard of the Cajun Creole song Tigalo? Yeah, okay. How many of you were ever, you probably won't remember that as a personal experience, but how many of you have ever seen one of the adults in your family take a child, put the child on a foot, and give him a ride? Yeah. How many of you have ever sung Sot Crapo? There are two ladies in the back who know all the songs. How many of you have ever sung Frère Jacques? Church Point Breakdown. Before you could walk, someone or another crossed a leg and put you on a foot, gave you your first ride, singing Tigalo, Tigalo. It was your first lesson in mobility. It was your first dance. In the playground or under the oak, you sang Sot Crapo with your cousins. You were learning double entendre, along with resilience and rejuvenation, an early lesson in transformational syntax. Mostly in the morning, you sang Frère Jacques to be awake, a call in rounds to mindfulness, to get on with your life, not to sleep your life away. And then came the other songs. Bonsoir Moreau, and J'ai passé, La Propre Manière, Viens me chercher, and Les Flammes d'Enfer. Everything comes to us through the body. The great metered muscle, Maître et Maîtresse, showing us how to sing, sex and love, loneliness and desire, how to fall apart, how to hold things together, when to stay, when to let go. The second part of the book deals with the historical figures from the deportation, particularly from the 1864-65 deportation of the Acadians from Nova Scotia. Those people who left Nova Scotia were Acadians, they weren't Cajuns. Cajuns something we made them to be later on. In 1755, Winthrop, a British man, called all the men and the boys of Grand Pre into the church, and he locked the door. And he told them that they would have to leave, that they could no longer live in a place that they had lived for 7 generations. When the doors were unlocked, they made sure that they separated families, that husbands and wives were separated, children and parents were separated, and many of the Acadians didn't make it out of that 9-year period between the reading of the deportation and the first large migration from Nova Scotia. One man who decided that he would spend the rest of his life fighting the British was Joseph Beausoleil Loses, and he's the major character in this set of poems. He was the leader of the Halifax Acadians. He supposedly had 10 children. The records indicate that 4 of them came with him to Louisiana, 3 sons and a daughter. The older sons took up fighting against the British with their father. And one of his older children, Jean, died right next to him. Jean and his friend, who probably was 17 or 18 years old, were fighting side by side. The friend was shot and he fell into the water, and Jean tried to save him, and both of the men didn't make it out of that particular experience. This poem is called Beausoleil Loses His Sun. All of the poems written in the second half of the book, and many of the poems in the first half of the book, are written in sonnet form. Only 14 lines to tell a story or to tell an incident. And the reason why I chose the sonnet form was because when I went to USL as a freshman and entered freshman class, I failed every essay that I wrote. And I went to talk to my English 101 teacher, and I said, "What can I do?" And he said, "Make sense." So that was my first experience with trying to communicate what was in my head and what was in my heart onto the printed page. So I wasn't very good at English, you know. And then about 15 years ago, when I went to Paris, I tried to speak French, and I thought I could speak French pretty well, until I began to get the reactions from the merchants in France, who said, "You know, we speak English too." So why don't you quit making a monkey out of yourself? And so there was this idea that I spoke a broken English and a broken French. And so what I did with this particular sonnet form was to create a sonnet form for myself, and to write a broken sonnet, where it has a kind of rhyme, and it has a structure that's the same for every one of the poems, but it's not a Shakespearean sonnet, and it's not a Petrarchan sonnet, or a Spenserian sonnet, or any other Keatsian sonnet. It's the Italo-Cajun sonnet is what I call it. Beausoleil Loses His Sun. It had been months before he felt he'd ever move to something like normal breathing again. They brought the news to him in the middle of the night. His son was gone. The groove grief cut was quick and full and deep, and he knew that in it he might lose everything they all believed in and walked behind. He wanted to burn his own house down that night, show everyone he could still be in charge. But he could not bring his hands to turn the flint towards the cleansing flame, and he could not get his fill of whatever it was growing in him now. He'd been alone before, spurned, and turned away from those he'd given himself to. Now he'd kill every softness he thought might take residence in what he loved, and he'd keep only what he had to have around him. He'd choose the hard way, always, if he had to choose. And then he'd prove he could come through anything, even breath, inside this noose. I have a kind of gratitude to Longfellow for writing the Evangeline poem, but he didn't get it right. but I have a gratitude that he wrote that story, and it sort of incubates the story or keeps the story warm for those of us who want to revisit that story in our own time. In this particular poem, I let Evangeline speak. I went to St. Martinville and I went to, what's the memorial to Evangeline. And, I look around and none of you would seem natural in that pose that Evangeline takes, sitting on top of that grave. You're all strong women, vital women, women with a kind of energy. Evangeline Chatibe, she's always so sweet and so timid. She wouldn't have ever made it on the trip. She'd have died, because there was a kind of strength. And one of the things that I knew when I wrote this particular book is that there would be strong women in it, and there are strong women. Elizabeth Brasse and Marie Berg and many of the other figures, Madeleine Trahon, one widow who had been deported to France and lived there for 20 years, and then took the opportunity after her Nova Scotia, after her Acadie husband died, took the opportunity to bring her children all the way across the Atlantic again to a place that she had never been. And one of the things that I try to remind people who are revisiting or listening to this story again is that this is 1765, 1785. They're coming into a place that's a territory. They're coming into a place that's not even firmly, recognized as a place that has a government. It's owned by people who had ideas of colonialism and so forth. But this particular woman brought her 3 children and came to Louisiana and settled in Louisiana. That's a story that gets repeated over and over again. I'm going to end with this particular poem, Evangeline Speaks. No, I'll read one other poem after Evangeline Speaks. But one of the things that is so important to me is that the kind of resilience that was necessary for survival was something that required both strong men and strong women. And there are 2 or 3 poems in here that also talk about the children who came. There were some children who were as young as 4 years old when they came to Louisiana. This poem is called Evangeline Speaks. And I wanted to say something else about that stature and that kind of, little Evangeline that's on the Evangeline made bread, image and so forth. She is important, and she's a sort of icon that helped us to identify ourselves. But that woman is a statue of Dolores Del Rio, who was the actress who paid for the statue and the tomb to be built after they filmed the film Evangeline. And there's nothing wrong with that. She's a pretty lady, but she's not the kind of person that I know in my ancestry. Evangeline Speaks. That girl you think you see beneath the oaks beside the Teche, she is other than the girl I was. I was surely with all those other women forced to leave a life they had grown into, but I was never what they were. Never a mother, never even married. When other women gathered reeds and grasses to weave into baskets, I was there and I may well have helped them. But let's be clear, I grew into something that had to do mostly with what people needed of me. I am the loyal one, the one faithful to a man I may or may not have held close. When rain and heat fall on fertile soil, things grow, and that is how I came to be. I was not among those that fought back, wielded axes, or negotiated with bears for a place to live. I was never with the women who foraged for medicinal teas to save a spouse in a wild land no one knew. I never nursed a child, never was smothered by want or dread. I never planted crops or took them in, never had to cleave through thicket and vine to make a way for myself. I was always covered by right image and right sound, measured neatly in what others wanted to believe. And the last poem that I'm going to read for you is called The Song He Left Behind. And I wanted to read this one just to give you a little bit of the history of that particular migration of Acadians. Many people think that the Acadians went from Nova Scotia en masse into Louisiana. That's not true at all. Only a small portion of the Acadians left Nova Scotia. And yet that small portion of people often are the people that we're connected to through ancestry. The group that came with Joseph Broussard was a group of 193 Acadians. By the end of the first winter, 50 of them had died of tropical fevers and various accidents and so forth. And this is by October of that year. They arrived in April. By October, Joseph Broussard was dead. And we don't know where he's buried. We're working on trying to find where, we imagine somewhere around Lauraville, where the original Camp Beausoleil was. I'm working in various degrees on two particular projects. One is to bring Amédée Ardouin out of the grave that he was buried in Pineville. And if you don't know the story of Amédée Ardouin, it's one that you should know. So one of them is to bring Amédée Ardouin back to Eunice, the Eunice area, the Eunice Basile area, and the other project I'm working on is to find Camp Beausoleil. But this is a song that I imagine that Beausoleil is hearing as he's dying of yellow fever, and it's called The Song He Left Behind. I can't recall just when the song began to take its shape inside my head. I found myself some nights all alone with nothing but this sound from who knows where. A cape making a place for itself inside a bay. Some little thing I'd done or heard came back to me as melody, the percussive so low they were hardly there at all. Sometimes it was Agnes, his wife, turned to sound, more prelude than song itself, and as natural as flow of breath on breath as she moved inside her life. What burned brightly in both our ways translated here into residual glow, something we hardly ever felt in our ordinary lives, or yearned for even as we did whatever it was we had to do. Now, thin as crepe, this song spreads inside my head. It's not about where we've been or gone. It's not about the nights at sea or being lost or endless scrapes I lived by. But there it is, fiddling its way inside these fevered bones. Thank you very much.
Another round of applause for Dr. Darrell. All right, we're going to take a small break here. Please take the opportunity of ordering some coffee or sandwiches or something like that. And then when we reconvene, we will begin the open mic.